The Moorton Heritage weekend takes place every year toward the end of summer. This being Britain, that inevitably means that at least one day of the 3 is going to be a washout, with rain falling on the stalls and the locals done up in Victorian costumes. Still, this being Britain, that kind of inconvenience does not tend to stop folks, and most years they just carry on, sodden and damp, as if the rain did not exist, sitting on their benches and snacking on their scones, as if it was a bright and beautiful summer's day. This year, however, the weather bucked the trend, and for once the sun shone on Moorton as a glorious blue sky, stretched out in celebration above. You would imagine people would be overjoyed, but again, this being Britain, they instead complained about the heat and how the costumes they were wearing, heavy suits in thick materials, bonnets and dresses with heavy laced-up bustles behind, were murder to wear in the sweltering heat. You just can't please some people. One person who was easily pleased, however, was my little brother Jake. He had spent the entire week looking forward to the Heritage weekend, and in particular to the fair that was always set up on the market grounds over that weekend. He'd begun his pestering campaign, begging my parents to let him go to the fair and the rides almost a week earlier. At first, my parents had refused on the grounds of safety, quoting my grandfather, who insisted with more than a small dose of xenophobia that he didn't trust them fairground people, and that he'd seen one of the rides being put together by a 9-year-old boy with a spanner. You'd never catch me on one of those death traps. When I reminded my parents that there had been a fair at the precise spot for the last 15 years, and not once had anyone been injured, they switched tactics, complaining that it would probably be throwing it down that weekend and that in the rain, the rides wouldn't be running anyway. Once it was confirmed that this wouldn't be a problem and that you were actually more likely to burn yourself on the metallic parts of the ride than get wet, my parents finally bent to my brother's wishes and gave him permission to go, albeit without actually volunteering to take him and instead shoving that responsibility squarely onto my shoulders. What was I supposed to do? He'd been looking forward to it for weeks, and if I said no, then his only chance of getting there would disappear. So naturally, I said yes, and dragged the little squirt with me to the market grounds. The fair itself was a typical, for a weekend, touring fairground, full of colourful lights, badly airbrushed images on the back of the rides, dodgy-looking vendors on badly amplified mics shouting, "Scream if you want to go faster." All the usual suspects were there: the waltzers, the hokey-looking ghost train, a shabby helter-skelter, and a caterpillar ride, which was essentially a tiny roller coaster, and which I have to admit I did look at suspiciously with the lingering thought that it might have been assembled by a child with a spanner. Star of the show, however, was a ride called the American Eggs. What exactly was American about the eggs, I have no idea, but the ride itself was easily the most popular ever since it first made an appearance about 10 years ago. For those who have never seen it, the American Eggs is essentially a Ferris wheel. Unlike on a normal Ferris wheel, however, the booths or pods that you sit in are not fixed in place. Instead, they are on a hinge that allows them to teeter and totter back and forth, so that they swing and go almost 360 degrees around. The result is that as the Ferris wheel spins and your particular egg gets higher, it also starts to swing forwards and backward, so that you are turned precariously upside down or go face first downward many feet above the market ground. Was it scary? Yes. Was it safe? Probably not. Was it the exact ride that Jake wanted to go on most in the entire universe? Absolutely. Hilariously, the ride itself always had a ring of fair workers standing around the bottom and watching carefully as each egg pod ascended. Not out of any concern for safety, but because they had figured out that going upside down often meant that items fell from the punters' pockets, and with each go around a veritable manner of coins, notes and mobile phones would drop from the heavens to be collected and claimed by the waiting workers below. As we took our seats in a 2-person egg, I could tell that Jake was nervous. He had that fidgeting, half-exhilarated energy that I myself used to have when going on the bigger rides, and seeing him so giddy made me smile. I strapped him in, double-checking that all the supports and buckles were firmly in place, and told him to take a deep breath as we set off. At first, as we went up, the egg only rocked a little, then suddenly, as if gravity had been sleeping and had only that moment caught up, we rocked backward in a long, deep arc so that we went almost entirely vertical. Jake screamed and, laughing through his terror, gripped my hand as the egg's counterbalance flung us forward almost as far in the opposite direction so that we were forced to look down at the cobbles many meters below. The same pattern repeated several times, and Jake was literally panting and gasping for breath by the time our egg reached an equilibrium close to the very top of the circuit. At the highest point of the ride, the highest point of the entire fair, and higher even than the roof of the town hall or the Moorton train station building, we paused for several seconds, with our egg perfectly still. Getting to that point did make me wonder if the ride might actually be quite fun if it was just a Ferris wheel without all the mad jerking. At the very top, the clear view over Moorton was spectacular. You could see the town itself, tiny and stretching in a long strip below. Around the sides you could see the hills rising up toward the moor itself. You could see Acres Woods off to the left, the chicken run, where old Ragbag the Scarecrow, terror of my youth, still stood like a sentinel looking out over his patch, and far away in the distance you could just make out the Marsden estate, where both my best friend and girlfriend currently lived. It was as I was admiring the view that Jake let out a different scream. It was a scream not of thrill or enjoyment, but of terror. At first, I thought the worst. That his buckle had come unfastened, or some bolt attaching the mechanism, and no doubt put there by a prepubescent boy, had come unstuck, but that was not the case. Jake was pointing, far beyond the egg, beyond the ride, and out to the edge of Acres Wood. I followed his pointing finger to match his line of sight, and all at once saw why he screamed. There on the edge of the wood was a thing that looked to me like it belonged in a horror movie. In shape, if not proportions, it looked like a man, but far larger, and though the word probably doesn't make sense, tighter. It was as if every muscle in the thing's body had been put on wrong, as if the elastic of the muscles was stretched too thin over a skeleton too large for it to fit across. Every sinew and tendon seemed taut and strung almost to the point of snapping in a way that made me think that movement or even existing would be a painful endeavor for whatever that damn thing was. At the time, though, it was not the thing's pain I worried about, for above the strangely proportioned body was a head that was anything but human. Huge, muscular jaws protruded out in something resembling the snout and muzzle of a dog, whilst a thick mane of tangled hair fell about the neck and shoulders. Ears, triangular, pointed out, not on the sides, but on the top of a head that lowered over a bloody mass on the ground, a mass that looked suspiciously like it had once been a person. Quickly leaning across, I covered Jake's eyes as I continued to stare, but the movement made the egg lurch forward and in response backward. I tried as hard as I could to right the thing to get another look at the thing and confirm for myself that I had seen what I thought I'd seen. Some wild animal, some creature from the darker parts of imagination squatting over its human meal at the very edge of the woods, but our descent had already begun. As the Ferris wheel again kicked into gear, we were flung forward and back as the eggs were designed to, but Jake no longer screamed. Instead, he sat in stunned, terrified silence. Once off the ride, Jake remained quiet and asked almost in a whisper if we could go home. Of course, I took him, and it was only a few meters from our doorstep that he stopped me to ask,
"What was that? That thing at the edge of the woods? Was it a monster?"
I shook my head and tried to reassure him. It was probably someone dressed up in a costume for the weekend, like an extra in the haunted house or ghost train out on his fag break or something. You know how people love to dress up for... Jake interrupted.
"But its mouth, someone in a mask couldn't stretch their mouth that wide, and the teeth were real. Marcus, they were real. And what was it eating? I mean, it looked like... Was it a person?"
I shook my head violently, trying to force the lie I was about to tell to at least look true. "No," I said firmly. "There's no such thing as monsters or dogmen, it's all made up."
"Dogmen?"
Jake echoed softly.
"What's a dogman?"
Inadvertently, I had placed the seed of an idea in his head. "Never mind," I said, and ushered him inside. Later that night, I left the house again, telling my parents I was off to see my girlfriend Claire. Instead of heading up to the Marsden estate, however, I instead rode my bike out toward Acres Wood. Around what we call the Biscuit Path, up the back of the woods, and close to the place where I'd seen that thing crouching. There was blood on the ground, but no sign of a person or of that thing. I stayed only a few seconds and pedaled back to town quicker than I had ever ridden in my life. The following day, the town was buzzing with the news that a young boy called Tom Wilson had gone missing the previous day. He had apparently been playing with friends, building a den somewhere in Acres Wood. The news report said that nobody had seen him since 3 p.m. the previous day. They also said they were confident that little Tom would be found. Watching the news with Jake by my side, I already knew that both those statements were wrong. We had seen him from high above the town, and he most certainly would not be found.